The person next to me is Lance LaDuke. Lance is internationally known as an educator, a writer, a speaker, and a performer. Some of you heard him play today, both in a symphonic band and in wind ensemble. He's our soloist for a concert tomorrow night at State Gym. He is a teaching professor in euphonium and music business. He is the coordinator of special and creative projects at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. An incredibly creative person, and he knows what to do to become creative and how to get there. And he is really a master teacher. Just an incredibly creative person. That's probably the best way to put it. He has a career as a performer. He's a former member of the United States Air Force Band. He is a former member of the Boston Brass. He has performed, I think, in like 23 countries in all 50 states. Just a pretty special guy, an incredible musician. Christian Carichner is here. Christian, a lot of you know him already. He is the Associate Director of Bands at Iowa State, Director of the Cyclone Marching Band and Athletic Bands. He also teaches low brass, tuba, euphonium, teaches courses in music education for us. And he did his undergraduate degree in Bachelor's of Music Education and in performance at Ithaca College. He then did a master's in tuba performance at Arizona State University. He has served as the brass caption head for the Phantom Regiment for many, many years. And he is also the first marching brass artist for Pearl and Adams for that company, where he consults on the design of low brass instruments. So he is somebody who was already taking instruments and how can we make instruments better and doing all of that. So that's a little bit about the people that are presenting tonight, and they'll provide some information. So we'll start, I think, with Christian, who's going to talk a little bit about the music challenge.
Sure. So when we met with Karen and kind of developed this challenge, we started to think about innovation in music and innovation in our industry. And it's definitely something that, exists within our industry, but when Karen talked about something, let's do something big, let's do something kind of splashy, I thought about let's invent a new instrument, or at least let's come up with a new way to design or build an instrument that already exists. You think about an instrument like the violin has largely remained unchanged for hundreds of years. The trumpet, very similar, slight modifications along the way, but when you look at a trumpet from 100 years ago versus now, it's largely very similar. So we wanted to think about what would a new instrument look like, what would a new instrument sound like, and then what would an older instrument be reinvented and reimagined as. So it's just kind of a twofold challenge. So you're going to build a team to invent or reimagine an instrument. So let's talk about developing a brand new instrument first. So by definition, a musical instrument is a device created or adapted to make musical sounds. Percussive instruments are usually found to either strike, shake, or scrape. Wind instruments usually produce a sound through a column of air blown through or across an instrument. String instruments use an implement to strike or scrape a string to cause vibrations that create sound. Electronic instruments are instruments that send signals that are interpreted by something, which in turn send a sound signal to an amplification device. So your instrument could be any or all of these kinds of instruments, but the stipulation is that it needs to be playable by a human being in real time. So you can't be pre-programmed. You can't press one button and it plays a whole composition for you. So it's got to be manipulated in real time by a human being. Your instrument could be designed with any sort of materials in mind, but instruments developed with sustainable materials would be considered more favorably in terms of judging and evaluation. Instruments that produce a variety of different sounds or ranges will be given preference over single sound instruments. And that being said, be creative in the different ways your instrument could be played or performed. Okay, so number two, it would be reimagining an instrument. So there's 4 words I want you to think about when you reimagine an instrument: sustainability, efficiency, economy, and equity. So musical instruments have been around for centuries, and some have barely changed at all. Is this because they're perfect as is, or are they waiting to get a spark of innovation? So your challenge is to redesign an existing musical instrument utilizing a different material or method process than one that has been used before. So should violins be made of wood? Does a saxophone need to use a mouthpiece? Your newly redesigned instrument should be able to, quote unquote, take the place of an existing one, both in terms of sound and function. So when you think about that kind of thing, you think about range. So if you're going to redesign something like a saxophone, it needs to have a very similar functional range of a saxophone. It needs to have similar intonation of a saxophone, meaning the pitch and how it kind of sounds, the characteristic sound. The idea would be to directly replace an existing instrument. And then, of course, instruments developed with sustainable materials would be considered more favorably. And ultimately, production costs and timeframes would be considered in that final evaluation process. Okay, so you're going to develop this or develop a brand new instrument or redevelop an instrument. And then the kind of second step is to collaborate with a composer, songwriter, or other artist to create a new piece of music featuring this newly developed instrument or reimagined instrument. So this is very loose and very broad. There are not very many stipulations to this to let artists run wild with this one. The accompaniment to this song could be pre-programmed, so it could be digitally created. So you could sit down in something like GarageBand and write a piece of music. That could be entirely electronic too. But the performance of the piece would need to happen with the new or reimagined instrument performing live and in real time. So if you took for example, I keep saying reimagined saxophone, so let's pick on somebody else. Let's pick on the tuba. Everybody picks on the tuba anyway, right? So a reimagined tuba, you could sit down and press play on an audio recording, and that's the accompaniment backing track, but somebody would need to be here actually playing the tuba to be able to manipulate the sound and actually create the music live and in person. So then what's going to happen is you're going to build a prototype of these instruments, and you can kind of see all the deadlines there, registration deadline, and then submitting the designs. And then we're going to announce 8 finalist teams. So 4 from each, 4 from the reimagined instrument and 4 from the invented instrument. And then $250 is awarded to each team to create a prototype and then work towards composing a song. And then in April is the Ignite Innovation Showcase, and that's when the judging actually takes place from those final 8 teams. Okay? I think that explains pretty much everything, Karen. So let's move on to who's speaking next. Oh, and then I guess I should say the final prizes. $500 is going to go towards that best composition. Oh, the slide went away, and now I don't remember the numbers. But $1,500 goes to the reinvented instrument. $1,500 goes to the brand new instrument, and then a $4,500 grand prize goes towards the best in show between those two, and then they get a free consultation with Conn-Selmer about possible production and development of your instrument.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we're going to turn this over to Gavin. And before we do that, I also would like to recognize Kimberly Hope, who's back here. She is a coordinator for this event and has just taken care of so many of the details. Could we recognize her and give her a round of applause? Thank her for supporting all of this, making it all work. Okay. Yeah. Gavin, are you up there?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Can I just share screen and launch right in?
That would be great.
Perfect. Okay, everyone, is my screen visible on the big screen? Perfect, thank you so much. So, hey everyone, just to reiterate, I'm Gavin from Conn-Selmer. I am by day a research and development engineer working on musical instrument design. And what I'd really like to talk about today and get into a little bit in broad strokes is what that actually entails, because musical instrument engineering inherently covers a lot of fairly different territory. And it's exactly because of that I think this is a really cool and compelling area. And actually what I do on a day-to-day basis overlaps pretty heavily with exactly what this entrepreneurship competition is all about. So I would like to start this off with just posing the question, even though it seems like I've been thinking similarly to some of the other moderators tonight in preparing this slide deck. I want to just pose the question to you all. What is a musical instrument? This is a early Stradivarius violin that has maybe the most recognizable form as a musical instrument in the world. Very conservative design that has not evolved wildly over the last few centuries. This is an electric guitar, which in fundamental mode of sound production is really, really similar to the violin in a lot of ways, but also relies on transducing sound a completely different way into a digital signal for a lot of recording today. It's not less of a musical instrument or more of a musical instrument, it's different. But going in that direction even further, this is a teenage engineering pocket operator. This is a musical instrument with no keys, no strings, no acoustic form of sound making that is able to make almost continuous spectrum frequencies and hundreds, if not infinite, textures and sounds. That's every bit as much of a musical instrument. And going the opposite direction, this is a jaw harp that can make not a lot of different frequencies and is still an instrument that has stood the test of time for centuries or potentially millennia, depending on which music theorist you listen to, but is an extremely dug in musical instrument in a lot of cultures. But extending that then to the research that I've been doing over the last couple of years, this image, if you ask a music theorist living in Korea studying Korean classicism, is a one single musical instrument. This is 22 people playing, in their eyes, one instrument, because it is so difficult to separate the physically different objects that these musicians are holding from their overall goal as one system, that even though this looks like on paper a handful of similar separate musical instruments to the ones that I showed in slides before, is this system not one instrument in sum total? But extending that even further, is this not one instrument in sum total? If you go to a Blue Man Group concert and listen to incredibly new and experimental, really fascinating instruments built out of PVC pipe that you can barely tell where one starts and one stops on stage, this is a musical instrument. But obviously I could do like 40 of these slides, but if I keep going, is this not a musical instrument? Is this not made up of many things that engage with music in some way, or melody or rhythm in some way? And so it gets me to sort of where I begin the design process, which is I've thought through a bunch of potential examples of where I might be able to start with defining a musical instrument. What is a musical instrument? And so where I start is, on the face of it, to be really literal, this is a tool for musicking. So this is borrowing a term from Christopher Small. Musicking is engaging in the act of music in some way, listening or performing or editing. And so to put a fine point on it, I would say that this starts with a musical instrument is an extension of the human body or bodies that empower people to create, interact with, or edit music in ways that they cannot do alone. This is more than our hands or our mouth or our vocal cords. This is sort of an extension of what the human body can do alone that allows us to make music. But even starting there, we've now defined what a musical instrument is. What does it mean to design a new instrument? And so I like to start from sort of a first principles approach of designing an instrument. Does this fit into the practice of an existing musical art, or does it create a new one? Will this instrument limit the user to a single mode or genre? Is this going to be a fixed scale? Is this going to be a fixed style of articulation that limits it to a relatively narrow genre? How will this transduce sound? Is this a wind instrument, a brass instrument, an electronic instrument? How will it exist in the physical world, if at all? Because one of the things that I find really compelling about a musical instrument is that it isn't just a sound. It's an object that stays relatively permanently in the world, that interacts with performance and with sound and with recording. And ultimately that leads me to, what does this project mean? As a sum total, the development of the instrument, the sounds of the instrument, the way that it physically lives in the world when it's not being performed, the impact that it leaves on the performers are all part of that overall project for me. And I think that that's the really exciting and compelling place to begin instrument design, is by saying the design process is part of the end product. The instrument is the sounds that the instrument makes, but also the way that it changes the way that we perform, the way that it changes the way that we think about sound. And that leads us to who that hero of the instrument is. Is this being designed for somebody who has maybe decades on a specific instrument and has practiced technique, maybe gotten advanced degrees, God forbid, in an instrument, just to learn how to be perfect at this existing thing that we need to fit into? Or is this somebody that's coming to it completely fresh with no technique at all? I mean, yeah, I could have put in a video here of me trying to play guitar, but you can imagine somebody that has really no fundamental basis on a certain instrument might need a different kind of approach than somebody who has a lot of experience on a specific instrument. But then extending that, not everybody comes at an instrument with the same physical abilities. Not everybody is going to be able to engage with a piano with 10 fingers on 2 hands. And that's a really critical part of the design process that we don't always address. Well, actually almost never address very well in designing new instruments or modifications of instruments that have been around for a really long time.
Lance, or Gavin, Gavin, I was thinking what you're commenting about is very important. It's part of the ideation process, right? As they're imagining. And one thing we encourage is distorted reality thinking. Act as if, on your gut feeling, you have an experience of music. What does that feel like? And it surfaces a lot of those questions that you raised. So I really love where you're starting with this.
Thank you. Yeah, and absolutely. I think that this is that ideation part of defining the scope of a project or understanding how to just sink your teeth in to begin with, really necessitates saying, let me step outside of my shoes and see this from the perspective of the 4th grader I'm designing this student French horn for that really can't navigate the partials on this instrument. Design this for any number of different use cases. So to zoom that into where I start with, all models are wrong, but some models, including this slide for me, are useful. This is where I start to talk about how a musical instrument in its performance case lives in the world. So obviously I overwrote this public domain image of one of my childhood musical heroes, Yo-Yo Ma, who I think has done a lot to democratize the understanding of instruments and music for a much wider audience than a lot of performers that came before him. Playing in a musical instrument, and what I love about this is you can see his instrument, the stage, himself, sort of all engaging in the way that he's making music. So I start with, on the right side here, a sound generator or transducer of music. He is physically creating a vibration. He is physically creating sound that is going into a medium, that second diamond after the arrow, the air, but also in this case through the pin into the floor. He's vibrating the stage, and that stage is changing the sound. You can see also the way that he's reacting to the music, his facial expression, visible through the photons that are hitting the back of your eyes, traveling out into the room and being received by our sensory apparatus, our ears, our eyes, the way that we engage even physical tactile vibration with what is being created by that performer, and then processed by our brain. And that's, I think, the last piece that's really critical in understanding a musical instrument is this isn't just being received by our ears and stopping as we understand that sound. It's being transduced into a signal that we evaluate in our mind. We bring all of our background, all of our experiences, training or lack of training that we have in music theory, understanding of pieces that we maybe have heard performed before, to that experience and reflect on it. We judge it whether we mean to or not, and fit it over our previous experiences. Which leads me to that same question. What are we designing for? So in the process of designing a musical instrument, we're not, I wear an engineering hat with Conn-Selmer. I'm not optimizing a bracket. I'm not designing a screw, right? It's not a super linear process where I'm saying, I need X, therefore I will optimize this way. part of the fundamental crux of designing a musical instrument is saying, what part of that system are we designing for? So for the sake of this talk, I'm talking mostly about that first branch of the process, that generator, that sound transducer. But I don't want to give the impression that I feel like that's where music making starts and stops. The education of that musician, the construction of that stage, the temperature in that room, the seats that audience are sitting in are all very much a part of that process. Mm-hmm. And so with that as the baseline, I'm going to share a little bit of my approach of how I've done this in the past and where I begin the process of designing musical instruments. This is a generic map of the design process. I'm sure that you've all seen this in school before. As you hang around the Innovation Center, I'm sure that there's like a poster of this outside of the bathroom or something. I certainly got this force fed to me in college and was rolling my eyes by the end. But it's a valuable model for what it is. So I'm going to give the explanation of the project that I worked on with Seoul National University and Seoul Institute of the Arts over the last couple of years on fellowship that was introduced along with me, and the way that fits into this design process. So this slide shows a rack of a traditional, or many examples of a traditional music instrument from Korean classicism called daegum. Daegum is a wind instrument. It's most akin to a woodwind instrument that operates a lot like a flute. You blow across a transverse hole. You get low pressure and high pressure oscillating back and forth, resonating. But the fascinating thing with daegum is that it plays a role in music completely different than what we would see in a flute in Western music. To begin with, it has a physical mechanism on the flute that sympathetically vibrates along with the air column. Can you all see my mouse, my cursor? Mm-hmm. So on each one of these daegums, you see a brass plate or a hole underneath a brass plate. In the daegum's design, there is the inside membrane of a wheat straw glued over a hole, 33% of the way between the mouth hole and the first finger hole. Extremely thin membrane that, as the sound travels through and is created on the inside of this instrument, sympathetically vibrates and adds other frequencies to the sound. Because of that, almost all of the technique and applications revolving around this instrument are built off of the way that the sound of the performer's air and the frequencies they're playing on the flute relate to enharmonically completely different sympathetic vibrations coming off of that membrane. And so starting my time in Korea working on a grant to develop musical instruments with Seoul National, knowing absolutely nothing about Korean classicism, I was shown this instrument and told, hey, try this. This is a really approachable instrument for Korean classicism. You could probably play this. And so I picked one up and looked like an ass because I couldn't make a sound and didn't know up from down. But I picked this up and was talking with a musicologist and said, hey, I'm a trumpet player. I played Baroque music on cornetto in college. I performed Gabrieli. This daegum is for spiritual music, oftentimes for polyphony in spiritual music. It's made of wood. It has sort of a buzzy sound. Here's a thing like that from my experience. This is a completely different thing, but this is what I bring to the table, right? The cornet or the cornetto was a Renaissance precursor to the brass instrument. It's a wood instrument with holes rather than valves that was used in sacred music in sort of the 15th and 16th centuries. And that is this first part of the design process. This is discovery. This is that first part where I'm saying, I don't really know about this, but I'm willing to learn. And here's what I bring to the table. I don't know anything about what you're telling me, but it does ring a bell in my mind. Let's figure out the relationship between those things. Let's brainstorm how those could connect and just sort of learn about how those could cross-pollinate and to make many different opportunities, many different ideas and see where the sticks land. And so I'm kind of biology and botany nerd, but I got into this with the researchers that I was working with, and the tegum is built out of bamboo. And so I said, okay, let's start there. One of the fundamental principles of this instrument that you just showed me is that it's always made out of this one very specific material. What does that material start us out with? If that's my use case, if that's my starting condition, where else could I start inside of this blank slate to design with? And with bamboo, one of the fascinating things that we got to very quickly, after just examining samples, getting our hands on it, sort of having that exploration and discovery conversation, is it has this really fascinating geometry. It grows very quickly, and it grows in segmented sections. When you cut it in cross section, you see that there are separate chambers on the inside of it. Tegums are actually measured not by physical frequencies that they vibrate at, but by how many segments of bamboo long they are cut to. And so intonation in that is not necessarily a just intonation or well-tempered intonation conversation, but rather a relationship to biology. And so I said, that's actually really fascinating to me. I would love to start there and think about some other instrument that we could build in that ecosystem that relates to it in some way. And this is that definition part of that design process. So this is where, whether it's with my job with Conn-Selmer and Steinway, or grant funding when I design a musical instrument, I say with a team, what part of that research do we really want to zoom in on? So we've just zoomed out. Wow, things are falling off my shelf. I'm sorry. We've just created all of these different options and researched all of these different beautiful opportunities. But among those, what are we going to focus on? And so here I'm starting by saying, really the hero that I'm going to design around is that physical material and this way that biology sets us up to build an instrument. I'm going to work inside of what that instrument allows us to do. And so you sort of start exploding again. We've narrowed it down to a relatively straightforward and small piece of information. We're going to start with bamboo, and it has something to do with these segmented pieces. And I was being asked to create a new instrument. So I said, okay, in this particular case, I'm going to need to be the performer. I know that I need to be one of the people that plays this. One of my friends in Seoul is the principal trumpet in the Seoul Philharmonic, just because we're both trumpet players. And I said, oh, two brass players, we can't do a lot of things. Most brass players aren't very smart. So I should probably keep this to something that we've done before. I kid completely. I know there's a lot of brass players, at least on screen. But so I started exploring, is there a way for me to relate that Renaissance cornetto or the trumpet that I play to this segmented, completely different material, completely different way of working? And so I brought this in front of composers. I brought this in front of performers. And I mean, this is me sitting down with a composer's workshop at Seoul National saying, hey, I think I could do something like this. What do you think? And that research, putting it in front of people that say, oh, no, I don't want to compose for that. I don't want to play that. Or, oh, yeah, I love the way that you're thinking. What if we, right, is a critical part of where, even if I think I have a really focused idea, now we explode it out to every possible place that we could go with that one sort of starting kernel to say, we're going to start with this material and this sort of biological use case.
Gavin,
Yep.
I might stop you there. You point out two very important components of securing your innovation idea: investigating and validating. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So what you did is you sought out these people, you investigated, you extended curiosity, they helped you imagine if, and you validated your assumptions, and they helped you validate what was accurate and inaccurate, which helped you further refine. And I think that's really an important tool. Often when people invent, they think, I have to do this myself. There's quite a bit of validating and investigating they can do. We have a lot of access to people all over the place that they can reach out to.
Absolutely. And I'm giving this talk from the perspective of a project that I did before I was with the company that I work with now, but I can't reemphasize that enough for the position that I'm in currently, or any other research that I've done. One person doesn't know the answer, no matter how much they know about something. In fact, sometimes it gets, especially, I feel like in my experience, it gets harder and harder and harder for me to steer a project the closer I get to it.
Mhm.
And there is incredible value in putting something in front of someone else and saying, hey, what does this do for you? And so one of the ways that I do that is actually putting it in front of not people, saying, here's the sound here. Let me look at this a different way. Let me step back and think about this a separate way. So this is a Fourier transform, just a way of seeing frequencies across the frequencies on one axis, across time on the other axis, and then decibels, which is the color scale, and saying, what does the shape of this articulation look like compared to this other instrument that I want it to be more like? Or what does this look like compared to this other instrument that I want it to be less like? What does the overtone structure of this instrument do in the performance space that I want it to sound good in? How does this relate to the physical space that I'm playing in? And what I find is that hearing that acoustically is critical, but being able to look at those data visually, or being able to feel that physically as a vibration in a space, the more different ways that I can have a sensory engagement with that information, the more I personally am able to wrap my head around it.
Mhm.
So this is one of my starting tools for any instrument that we're working on. The second then would be zoom in. What can I learn about the way that this material works, the way that that material can be used or manipulated or treated to get somewhere else? And so this is an example of a microscopy slide from, I sliced and polished and did SEM samples of the bamboo that I was working with to say, hey, I don't know much about bamboo. Let me look closer, putting on sort of the engineering hat for a second. What does this tell me about what I can do with bamboo? One of the things that this slide told me that's kind of readily apparent is, this is zoomed in enough to see some of the cell wall structure, but not enough to see inside of cells. Bamboo is really porous. Bamboo has a ton of porosity that I'm not dealing with when I'm designing this, or when I'm 3D printing out of this. It's a completely different material that needs to be treated differently to work with sound. And there we go. So this gets me to that, through that stage where it's development. It's iterative research, questioning, and understanding what it takes to get a prototype where I want it, and then to extend that narrative and say, okay, I need to iterate again. What did I learn from this prototype? What's the next question that I need to ask? Get that in front of peers. How do they respond to it? What do I need to do next? That sort of second divergent or option generating part of the design process as I see it. And then this is sort of where it goes after that. We've generated a lot of options. We need to go from the 40 odd prototypes that I made in plastic and in bamboo and all of the different tuning systems that I tried and the different resonators that I tried, and say, how does this perform? And at the end of the day, what I was hoping to get out of this was a collaboration with a student lab that was building their own synthesizers and wanted to engage those synthesizers with natural material acoustic instruments. And also my friend Iaram on the left side of this, holding a musical instrument, who is a daegun player and a tumso player with a Korean classicism background, who currently performs mostly electronic and ambient music. And so I brought it into that situation with them and said, okay, let's try this and see, out of this field of prototypes that we've now gotten to with a variety of different trusted users and researchers, how can we crunch this down to what I really need to focus on in the end? How do we cut the ones that aren't going to work? And so we did probably 40 hours of research over the course of 2 weeks, pretty much full time, taking this over the course of about a dozen concerts in a couple different cities, I just played a different instrument every night. Yeram played a different instrument every night. And we just said, okay, what's working? Which ones are making us sort of work together and make music and feel like we're turning off the mode of thinking about the instrument and having something in the way of making music, and transitioning into that moment where we say, the instrument kind of went out of my head and I'm thinking about making music and I'm thinking about communicating now. That's the way that we go from 40 prototypes down to the last one, the solution at the end of the tunnel. And so without getting into the mechanics of which version of that instrument, I mean, I could talk about the prototypes that we built for 6 hours. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but the way that we get from those 40 prototypes to the ones that let us feel like we were achieving what we set out to do was we put them in the context of the instruments that they needed to perform with, and we converged on that solution and cut out the ones that weren't working so well. And that brings me to sort of the end of where I review my design process and what I am really interested in designing musical instruments. Is there's a lot of different ways to start this. There's a lot of different ways to study it and research it. I've done it this one way in that project. I've done it different ways in other projects. But the interesting thing setting out on what you are going to do in your project is, what do you value? What are you going to start with as your research case? And as you do that research, what does it point you towards? For me, I'm really fascinated in that of new technology or pushing the historical craft of building musical instruments. I think there's this fascinating through line with the guild economy that set up musical instrument making and the crafts that were developed along the way, and understanding the place of those instrument makers in art. You can't just bulldoze over that and say, hey, new technology is better, we're going to do it differently. For me personally, I find it fascinating to say, this is my self-expression of the balance between that technology and that history piece. But at the end of the day, I'm finding that balance and I'm expressing the way that I want to find it so that I can build tools that let other artists do their job. Building tools that let other artists say what they're going to say and not have to think about the instrument that's in their hands getting in the way of it. And so I guess I turn that back around and face it at all of you in the audience to say, or to ask, what will you do? Are you going to be the one that optimizes and makes the better material that gets the last 5% out of centuries old design? Do you want to spark discussion? Are you going to come up with a discursive design or an experimental instrument that makes people say, oh my God, why do we make music that way? Or why do we use instruments that way? Or maybe on the lines of what I have done or in a different way, are you looking to find balance between a few of those different variables that show up in the research? I think that at the end of the day, that's the most beautiful thing about musical instrument design compared to any other design discipline for me, is it sits at this fascinating intersection between building physical things and engineering objects that have very complicated systems, but also millennia of art and tradition and education, and also perception and understanding an instrument that will be performed on, not just a designed object that sits on a table to be looked at or so I guess with that, I would love to open it up for questions or comments and listen to what you all think about where you will find that balance, or questions you have about finding that in your own work.
If you've got a question, if you want to use.
I will make a statement. One thing I find very interesting is we tell the students when they're designing or inventing anything, and what I really love that you focused on is theme. Theme, which stands for the highlighted essential message, elevating your story. So the theme. And I think that people find their passion and their story in a lot of ways. It could be, my story is sustainability. That's the story I'm translating when I interact with music. Or my story is everyone should be able to make music and have an experience of beauty without having to be an expert. Or my story might be, people who can't work in traditional ways should be able to make music. So I think that getting in touch with your story and having passion about it is really part of what will make this an award-winning experience for people. Yeah. Michael, do we have any questions from our audience?
I don't think so.
Okay. Any questions from Lance or you or Christian?
I think we're good. Gavin, that's absolutely tremendous. Let's thank him for being with us tonight. Yeah, Gavin.
And Gavin, you're welcome to stay and stay on with us. And we will absolutely be connecting with you, I'm sure, as we go through this process. Yep. And I will be connecting with you, certainly. So
absolutely.
Great. Can you still hear us, Kimberly? Great. All right, back to you, Michael and Lance.
Okay, we'll let Lance kind of take over from that. One of the things that we're hoping to work out with Conn-Selmer is there's a possibility of creating some summer internships with them. So that's something, if you're interested in that, wouldn't that be fantastic? That they've had some of those in the past, and that might be a really nice byproduct of this whole process. So we're going to turn it over to Lance LaDuke, and we'll let you talk about pitching your project and moving this forward.
Yeah, so if I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, I think everything that Gavin said, I completely, wholeheartedly agree with. I think this is a fantastic opportunity, and I jumped at the opportunity to be a part of it. I think it's an incredible marriage of what I care about, which is music and the arts, and the notion of entrepreneurship and innovation. And so the 4-step process that he took you through is exactly right. I completely agree with it. And a lot of times it's difficult for musicians to think in terms of entrepreneurship because we don't sometimes think of the music that we make as a product. And sometimes we kind of bristle against the notion that this thing that we care about and that we do so much, spend so much time involved with, is a product. And if we can get comfortable with that terminology, then the world opens up for us in a really interesting and I think useful way. Entrepreneurship is often thought of as a noun, but it's really, and to my way of thinking, it's a way of thinking. It's a series of actions. You are an entrepreneur. You do things which are entrepreneurial, and you look for ways to innovate in the universe that you inhabit. And so I guess I was thinking, if I was tackling this challenge, how might I do it? And there's a thing I like to tell my students, which is that you have an unfair advantage. Each one of you who are participating in this event, each one of you, or your individuals or the teams, has an unfair advantage that the other teams don't have. What is it? I have no idea, but you do. And the unfair advantage can be where you're from, who you're related to, what you're interested in, what you're good at, what your brother is good at, what your neighbor knows, what you saw on television, just the things that have made you uniquely you. There's going to be one of you come down the pike ever. And so if you don't share that with the universe, we all lose. And the counter is that if you take that unique set of interests and skills and partnerships, and you combine it together in a way that speaks to you, it probably speaks to another person. So you owe it to yourself to think about, if it's me, the first thing I'm going to do is think about, what are my unfair advantages? What am I already good at doing as a musician? What instruments do I already know how to play? Am I a percussionist? If that's the case, then I have a certain skill set. I have a certain way of thinking about music. I have a certain entry point that somebody who is a string player or a wind player or a vocalist or an electronic musician, does not. It's not to say that one's better, but you come at it in a way. There's a way of thinking and a way that you've learned that got you to here that you can use to your advantage. If you're working on part of a team or as part of a team, well, then your combined superpowers, you should put to your own advantage. You should build upon those things. If you're from a family which has a long tradition of singing around the fire, well, you know a thing that somebody who didn't have that experience doesn't. You, I think, would also do yourselves a favor to spend some time thinking about, and Gavin talked about this as well, who beyond you, beyond the aesthetic pleasure of doing this thing that you're doing, who do you imagine this is for? We deliver music as a way of communicating sound because there's no other way for us to communicate this emotion or this feeling or this whatever it is that we have to get out of us. With sound, words won't do it. And so the music is the thing that has to do that. And we hope to deliver it to somebody. And there's an old saying, if you're marketing to everybody, you're marketing to nobody. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Microsoft, those are companies who are trying to reach as many people as possible. We tend to be more, well, I mean, there's the Justin Biebers and there's the Katy Perrys and the insert your favorite celebrity here, who are trying to reach a very, very broad audience. My advice to you is to think about who's the ideal audience member for this thing. Who do I want to move with this music? And how might I do that? And then if I combine that with my superpowers, then that might give me a starting point. If I know that this is something that I want my mom to cry because this thing was so beautiful. All your mothers would cry when they heard it anyway because you're the best thing that ever happened. So, but I want to move that person, or I want the people at my church to stand up and cheer when they hear this thing, or I want to affect the football fans just the same way that the marching band does. Who are you trying to reach? What might cause them to have the reaction that you want? And the reaction doesn't have to be joy. It can be sadness. It can be sorrow. We're all junkies for the music, right? And so we have music. We eat certain things because they make us feel a certain way. We do certain things because they make us feel a certain way. We watch certain things, consume certain media, do have certain hobbies, and we listen to music because it does different things for us. It energizes us. It can be a balm to us if we're in pain. It can be inspirational. It can be many, many, many things. So what is the function of your music and what's the best vehicle for that? Maybe your instrument is an incredibly small physical thing that you have to get very close to hear. And that's an extremely different experience than something that would resonate literally and figuratively on the football field, right? It's a question of scale. You do yourself a favor to put a face to that person. And it can be an actual person that you know, or it could be a symbol of a person that you know. I want it to be this type of person. And now we have our superpowers, and now we know who it's for. And then we go through this process that he was talking about, where you start very, very broadly, and then you contract, and then you go back to broadly, and then you go back to contracting. And so when you go into brainstorming phase, I would encourage you to let your brains run wild and free. And for those of you who are not familiar with brainstorming or the process of brainstorming is not the time to vet the ideas. Brainstorming is volume, 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 volume. Most ideas wins. Right? That's what you're going for now. We don't want the best idea yet. We want as many ideas as possible. And some of them may be ridiculous. And it could be the case that the more ridiculous the idea, the better you end up finding a route to a thing. You could say, we want to make there is a thing, believe it or not, called the Vegetable Orchestra. You can go look it up online and see their videos. And this group, they're in Berlin, and they will show up in a town to do a concert, and they would go to the produce store or a produce market, and they would buy the vegetables that they needed to make their instruments, and they made instruments out of vegetables. And by doing so, a lot of times they would carve out parts or hollow out parts of the vegetables, and they took all of those parts and they made soup. And so they would play this concert with the instruments that they made out of vegetables. And then at the end, they served soup to everybody. That is a ridiculous idea. And it's awesome. And who would have thought of that? That wonderful group of Berliners thought of that. And so no idea in brainstorming phase is too ridiculous. Let your brain go. And then when all of that stuff is out, then you can start to decide, okay, well, based on our superpowers and our final user, these seem to be more interesting. Or if you decide that sustainability is really, really important to you, then you could ask yourself sort of some mental exercises like, if we didn't spend a nickel, what could we do with just the stuff that went around, or purposed stuff? Or we're going to take that recycle and we're going to, whatever's in that recycle bin is going to be our first prototype. And so you put a limitation on yourself. You go think really big, it's anything that we could, and what's a thing we could do and no money. And then you find out that this was an interesting idea that you to another, which to another, which leads you to another. So there's a, in entrepreneurial thinking, there is a philosophy that I'm a big fan of, which is a lean startup. And so I like to think of it as it's sort of a ready, fire, aim mentality, where you kind of come up with an idea, build a prototype as quickly and as cheaply as possible, and then you put in front of somebody to get their reaction to it. And then based on their reaction, then you reiterate. You take the best parts and you work it into the next others. There you go. There's the visual orchestra. Not bad, huh? Actually, it actually sounds just you would think when you're looking at that. But actually, they make like a version of a sort of a trombone, lots of percussive instruments. So there's a string there at the top. So the sky is the limit. If you happen to live, well, get permission from your parents. If they have a garden that they go raiding and it's for a music project, ask for permission first. But anyway, so have the idea, build a prototype, put it in front of you. And then repeat, right? Lather, rinse, repeat. So I want to get a prototype together, I think you have till January 21st or something to pitch your idea. If it's me, by Thanksgiving, I'm going to have a thing that I can talk. I don't know what role I'm going to talk to Andrea about at Thanksgiving. All I'm going to hear about is her bunions. So if I can come up with ideas that I talk to her about at Thanksgiving, I can start to get an idea of the thing to listen to. Have you played an instrument? You might have an opportunity to find out things about your that you are interested in over your Thanksgiving day. And it didn't get involved in music, why didn't you? Or if you did, was it? And if you stopped, why did you stop? And what caused you to go listen to a thing? What kind of music causes this? What kind of, and so use there's a great test bed of potential customers for you to go approach. And then as soon as you hit the ground running, building a little something, and then have it, play it for somebody, and then their reaction, and then that, and build it into the next thing. So by the time January 20th comes around and we have to pitch our concept, for me, it's probably my 50th concept. I'm trying on all sorts of different things and figuring out people will learn more about that. Or do you want more stuffing? You're going to based on the reaction you get, you can just, okay, this is worth doing. Or you find out you forgot your uncle is a woodworker and you're like, oh, that's pretty interesting. Could I learn how to do XYZ? And now all of a sudden it hadn't occurred to you that you had an unfair advantage, which is your uncle woodworking shop. And now you found out, well, there's an opportunity that we didn't have before. Okay. I want to talk to you about how you will pitch the idea eventually. When you get to the point that the idea is refined and then you move on and you pitch to the judges, here's the thing. I want to talk about that process. Before we do, there was a really, really interesting and important man in the history of music, certainly in the last few hundred years, and of particular interest, Dr. Golemo, because he happens to be the guy who invented the instrument that was his primary instrument, a guy named Adolph Sax that he knows a bunch about, that I think you'll find his story to be very useful and interesting.
Yeah, as you may know, last day was National Sax. It was Adolph's birthday. There actually was a person named Adolph Sax who invented the saxophone. And a lot of people say it was the only instrument ever invented. That other instruments evolved, flutes, drums, strings. He was an instrument designer in the early 1800s. And even though we think saxophone is primarily a jazz instrument, it was a commissioned by the French military band to create an instrument to make the alto voice military band that formed outside stronger. Up to that point, they had these little E-flat alto horns that were kind of puny. They did sound real big. And he basically took a brass instrument and put a wood mouthpiece on it. And he also did things where he took brass mouthpieces, put them on woodwind instruments, instruments that had ophicleides and things like that. So he was kind of at his time. He was doing some pretty inventive things. He had a neat studio. But literally invent the instrument to say, okay, we have need to make this this alto voice stronger. Smart enough to then say, okay, let's make this instrument in different sizes: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And even though saxophones now are alternated in the key flat and B, originally they were in the keys of C and F, because he thought that was a bit not only for the marching band, but because this is maybe an instrument that could be used in the orchestra. So one of the things that he did right away was that he found some like Berlioz and other composers and said, would you consider for this in the orchestra, trying to create a market for the instrument, because, you know, this is a new thing. So he tried to get it to go both ways, and ultimately moved to E flat and B flat. Didn't get enough people for the instrument. So you know what he did? He was smart enough at his own publishing company. But 1850, 1870, actually the 1870s, he sold it in 1878. This is like the piece of music from his publishing company, this publishing company, because he was smart enough. If I'm going to sell this instrument, if I market this, there's got to be some music. And so that's kind of the second part of this whole innovation process, is you've got to come with some music that works for this. In addition to just writing that, he said this saxophone music that works for the instrument, he was smart enough to know that writing for the soprano sax is then writing for the sax. That for the soprano sax, it's more of a melodic instrument, and we hear the high notes. Bari sax, you want to exploit the lower register, it's instrument, and that's the neat thing about that instrument. So he had write for very specific saxophones, but again, he started his own publishing company. These are a couple of front pieces that he had. You can tell very French, very fancy, and ultimately he ended up selling his company late in his life to Selmer, which is again coming right back to the Conn-Selmer. He sold everything. They have all these plans, and if you ever to Brussels, in Belgium, there is probably one of the greatest instrument museums in the world. There's another one in Dakota. I know that's really good. They have a ton of instruments made by Ado Sax in there, and not just saxophones, but brass instruments and all kinds of things that he with. A very inventive person, but he knew what the was. He had went in different directions, and he did something extraordinary with putting a mouthpiece on a brass instrument, and then had okay, now how do I get this thing? How do I market this? How get this? Well, you've got to have music for it. You've got to have music that really shows off the parts of the instrument. Okay, all music is necessarily going to work for this, and found a way to get other to write for it, and he had a really good, I think, that, and it's worked because it's still around, right? It's
Michael, Michael, can you hear?
We can.
Can you hear me okay or not?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of my favorite topics is innovation by accident. And what you're talking about is what's discovered and expanded accidentally as a result of innovation. And so the exploration of the instrument then leads to the publishing company and composing the music. And so I think our students should be on alert for innovation by accident.
Right. Yeah. When Sax invented the instrument, jazz wasn't even around yet, and who knew that this was going to be like one of the prime instruments for jazz, a whole new thing. Yeah, pretty neat.
So I think it also brings up an additional interesting point, which is much of what I was talking about before was kind of sort of more towards creating a new instrument from the ground up. But many innovations come of an adaptation of an existing, which is one of the categories for this, where you're taking form of saxophone or a trumpet or a guitar. You're going to impact it in some way, come up with a new application of this existing technology. I think there's a slightly different entry point that I would add to the strategy in terms of dealing with that. And that would be to start from the position of what's difficult about doing this? What is difficult about the trombone? What is difficult about playing the guitar? What is uncomfortable about playing the piano? And where are the pains, either literal or figurative? And how might I change the material, the design, the layout of the instrument to make it easier to play, or to make it more efficient to play? I've experienced, I teach an instrument, euphonium, which is, the euphonium derived from the Greek word euphonos, which means unemployable, which that was, so the euphonium, it's like a baby tuba. It's a lot like a tuba, but not as popular. So it's, anyway, an instrument that is shaped like a tuba, but it's about half the size of the tuba. And I have 7 euphonium students in my studio at Carnegie Mellon. And one of the students in the is a junior, and she's an amazing player, but she's diminutive. She's quite a small person. And the layout of the instrument is such that it's really difficult for her to reach one of the valves, to the degree that she's developed all sorts of wrist issues. And there are no existing designs of euphonium to account for the size of this human. So there is the opportunity for you to consider this not only from a sustainability aspect, from an accessibility aspect. Who are musicians who are built differently than we are? Instruments don't them. And what hoops do they have to jump through, or are they even invited to the party to participate in doing this that we love, but for the fact that they were built differently than we are, or something has happened in this, that their abilities are different than ours. And if the trombone doesn't fit them the way it fits all the trombone players, then that is off limits. So that's a wonderful approach to, you might think of coming up innovation. The innovation could be just the thing that the student is waiting, that some young man or some young woman is waiting for, and going to be the entry point for them to get excited about music as we are excited about music. Just another way to think about it.
Of course. Add something to that. He's talking about, finding a better way to, hardships that we have playing instruments. There's also things that some instruments better than others talking about, and that's important for us to understand. Band directors know that brass players can repeated notes much easier and much faster than woodwinds can, maybe with the exception of flutes. We also know that woodwinds can do technical things much easier than brass instruments. It's, coming down in thirds or something like that. We can do that easier than trumpets, than trombones. But they're, instruments do. So each instrument has some sort of an issue that, can we make this better? Can they do this better? How we fix them? Certainly, there's all instruments have issues. How do we make it better? How do we make it better for the players?
All musicians have to, but that's a different session. So before we close out this session or this portion of the evening, I want to just sort of give you some strategies about how you pitch your idea. One thing you could do, which would be great work between and when they're going to do this, is start watching Tank, or there's Dragons is the British of that, and there's just hours and hours of it online. And just sort of watch. You can listen to the investors' reactions, but it's really interesting, I think, for you to spend some time watching people who are giving the pitches. And what the best pitches tend to have in common is an explanation of the problem they're trying to solve, why they tried to solve this problem, who it's for, and what their solution is. And so if you come at that same sense of, we set out to create this blankety blank because we could find any examples of music that did this in this way. Or going back to the earlier example, playing the whatever incredibly difficult task for people who are extremely tall or extremely short. Like if you're kind of in the middle, then great. But we found there was a real problem with this. And so we set out to found out that blah, blah, blah. And we talked to so-and-so and he said they were so blah, 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 blah. And so we come up with this solution. And here's how it works. And then you take on this journey. Now we're in, it's, if you can start and stay with the story, as a beautiful alliteration that I wish I did, but I did not. If you can start and stay with story, then you have the list where you want them. I care about that. I was talking to my mom and she said she gave up on playing the piano when she was 17 because she just felt like she wasn't any good. She didn't know that she could ever get any better. And so I wanted to create an for her that gave the same sort of passion and did that same thing that I have, but wasn't so difficult for her. Okay, me. Like, wait, what was the solution? How did it? So the storytelling act of it is a key component. We get excited about, it does. If you push that button, it does this cool thing, and wait, watch this, and I'll pull this string. But it goes back to one of the first things that I said. We are doing this, all of this, the con tomorrow, marching band shows on Saturday. We're doing all of the instruments that Gavin is creating, the work he's doing, all is because we want to communicate with other humans. And this is the way this is the way for us. Visual artists do it in an awesome way. Dancers do it in an awesome way. Dramatists do it in an awesome way. Architecture has its own language, and for us, it's with sound. So start there, keep you for the entire duration, and then when you go to pitch, make sure that hear the song that you're trying to tell us. Hear the song that you're trying to convey with this new innovation, this new instrument, this new way of playing, this new way of bringing the sounder in here and in here out to us. I don't know. That felt like like a football or something. Right? Anybody have questions or anything to clarify? Or are you curious about any of the steps along the way? Or You want to say?
Where do they go for help? Where do they go for help? So as they're doing their exploration, Michael, Lance, Gavin, where do they go for help? Who do they talk to when they're talking about practicalities or like access to some of the technology Gavin showed? Michael, do we have any of that thing that visualizes sound? Have that type of equipment?
For visualizing sound, that's a free app if you have an iPhone or an Android. So go on the App Store, download ftplot.io. The best $0 you'll ever spend.
Well, I get to build on. I think just like I want to make a innovative trombone. Well, then go for all the trombones that you know and be, hey, what's your favorite part about playing the trombone? What's difficult playing the trombone? Go to whoever teaches trombone or class brass here. What have you done along the way? Find me educators. So hit up little professionals. If you, the thing we always students at my school is own the thing. I'm a student at Iowa State and I'm doing this really cool thing. To learn more about trombone, could I have 15 minutes of time? There's a few people that are professional trombone players or cellists, or I don't care what they are, especially in music. There's very few people say no. And so I'd say just go for it. Especially if you keep the ask to, can I have 15 minutes of, if you say, can I have a half hour? Can I have an hour? And then it's like, well, maybe like, what's this about? Can I have 15 minutes of your time? That doesn't feel much of an ask. Somebody like us or for Gavin, I'm guessing, not to speak for Gavin.
Absolutely.
And what happens is if you ask a good question, you're polite and you're interesting, the 15 will blow past and then well, could we schedule a longer conversation? Or the next thing you know, it's 45 minutes. And who else you need to talk to is so-and-so. And there's another wonderful thing that you should always ask when you're in one of these sessions. And that is there something else you think I'd have asked you about? Because it might be that they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, you know what, Tim been doing this for 40 years and anybody who would listen, nobody will modify euphonium so that people can play this thing or whatever. So how these questions is really, really important. Try and ask open-ended questions. Do you have difficulties playing the trombone? No. 14 minutes later, that's a really awkward conversation. What are your favorite things about playing trombone? How often, we'll go to the banjo. So often do you have to change your string? Like what's an annoying part? Changing the strings. How often to do that? How big a problem is that for you? On a scale 1 to 10, is that a horrible thing to do or not that big of a deal? And you're looking for the things that, yeah, this is a dream. And those are the that will lead you to interesting.
One more question you think about is, I wonder what it would look like if that question of leaning forward and imagining with somebody, what would it look like if you could play your instrument and it was scaled, or you could play your instrument with someone, or you could. So that wonder what it would look like if leads to all sorts of type innovation. Gavin,
absolutely.
Go ahead.
I was just going to build on what both of you just talked about. There's, I think, one of the hilarious quotes is the famous one that goes, talking or writing music is like dancing about architecture, right? Like it's, to some extent, it's a little bit ridiculous to take what we were just talking about, an art form we use because we can get an idea out a different way, and then sit down and say, so can you tell me about what you're listening to when you play your 200-year-old cello? It's like, no, I can't. I can try, but I'm not there. The follow-up question that always gets me in the door is to say, can I have 15 minutes of your time? Can I talk to you about this? And once it feels like something is going to say, can you show me? Can you walk me through what you think I need to hear? Because especially in a music text, I find that goes a long way when trying to articulate things about overtones and vowels isn't going to get me there anywhere near as effectively.
It's a super cool, and so you don't have to interview people. You can, if that's a useful thing, but go watch live music. Go if what you're doing is say string band based, it's banjo, fiddle, mandolin. Like if that's a thing you want to go do, watch hours and hours fiddle band stuff. Go find live fiddle bands and watch the players just while they play, and notice if they're doing, they're like string, or they're doing things that appear to be uncomfortable. Watch how the audience reacts to what they do. Watch how they prepare. Go if what you're doing is be found in a beginner band room. Ask your old band director, hey, can I just sort of sit and be a fly on the wall to watch your rehearsal, and then watch, say, the clarinet section and see what the tendencies are. Do you squirm after a certain amount of time? Do you struggle in certain passages? So you don't have to ask them anything. You just can observe and sort of feel, oh, they must have issues with this. You have lots of issues with this.
That's great.
One of the things I was thinking of is, might not be bad, Ball Riemann Music, we call down there and they deal with repair issues. And, I wonder if somebody down, wish they'd built this, wish this instrument could do so. Or I'm always fixing these, or why doesn't this work? And students, many problems with these. That might be a good to start too. But there's people at Riemann Music full-time that they do all the time.
So I'm also curious about what people do who can't play an instrument. What would it look like they could if they didn't have an experience of playing something without having to learn it in a traditional sense? So that question I always thought that was good to start. Really, you're going to share where we can look for the code and where people can register? Great.
Okay, hi. Just in case any of you are planning on doing this competition, need to know where to register, you will want to go to the Student Innovation Center website, sictr.iastate.edu. If you saw the flyer, or you have the flyers or buildings, there's a QR code, so it'll take you to the right spot, but it's this page. To get to it, just in case you do what I did, innovation programs, dash and sprint competitions. I'm just going to show you, and then just scroll on down until you see the music and click button. So again, you're going to want to go here. There are instructions and a timeline of each piece that you're going to want to keep in mind. There is going to be an option for you at the bottom to register your team. We just need one person to kind of go as the team lead. Doesn't necessarily mean you are the leader of the group. It's totally up to you how you structure your team, but just one person kind of register yourself and just type in the information for anybody else who's on the team. You're going to hit submit. And then when you're ready, I would suggest you register soon, but when you're ready, you use this. It says video submission. It's, I don't think it has to be a video, does it? It could be any type of mission that, yeah. So I will get that fixed, but do you have any, yeah, does it have to be a video or can it be any sort of, yeah, PowerPoint. Yep. So whatever your mission is, we want you to answer some questions along the way. So you look at that, you do that. Oh yeah, it could be Word, PowerPoint, video, PDF, a really cool TikTok, whatever you want to do, but you're going to want to load it here and then hit submit. And again, the deadline for that is, I think the 21st is what someone said, and I think that's accurate, but yep, January 21st. And then a week later is when they will decide who the 8 teams are that will move forward with the competition. So if anybody has questions, feel free to ask me after this is over, but this is where you're going to go to get yourself going.
And really, if I would think I would prize an opportunity to do a video clip and submit a video clip with my story, my passion, why I came to the story, because I think Lance's point is well taken, and Gavin and Michael also, the story is part of the experience of the instrument. Okay, Mike, you want to close us out? I do want to make sure to thank Gavin as well, and Gavin, I'll be in touch with you absolutely, get you some contact information as well. Michael, can you close out?
She wanted you to sing something.
Feelings. No, kidding. Okay. I think we thank you for being here tonight or for this. We can just hear all of the wheels, clicking. Just everybody's thinking through all of this. And this terrific of the expert that we had tonight with LaDuke and with Gavin Brehm, with Christian Carichner, helped me in thanking all of them, and Ken and Hope for supporting this and for supporting the innovation in music. We are just thrilled to have this. So, big round of applause for all the people putting this together. Thank you, Karen.
Great. This is fabulous. Gavin, thank you so much. And guys.
Thank you.
Good luck on your concert tomorrow.